The question raised in the title of this conversation, can democracy exist without free speech and a free media, is of course a rhetorical one. And as my friend here told me, you can start with this question and stop, because it is quite obvious that it is very much a part of it. You know, it is self-evident that it is this right alone that makes a human being out of dust. It reflects a principle recognized by the Buddha in his sermons and transmitted through Ashoka's edicts. Long before modern constitutions came to be drafted, you had Euripides, the Greek dramatist, point out that this is slavery, not to speak one's thought. So he recognized the connection between slavery and silence. Milton placed the capacity, again quotes, to know, to utter, and to argue freely according to conscience above all other liberties. The American Revolution gave voice to the First Amendment, stating that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. History's verdict is clear. Democracy or human society itself cannot exist without free speech. Yet, the struggle for the freedom of speech and expression in this country marks our every passing day. Each day we have to confront this. If we are to trace the arc of freedom of speech and expression in India from the late 18th century to the present day, three aspects stand out. One, that the manifest intent of those who ruled was to control the speech and even the thoughts of those they ruled over. India got its first law to control the press in 1799, when the East India Company passed the Censorship of Press Act. The British colonial order, both under company rule and the British Crown, was based on controlling the public narrative, which is why the British Empire is sometimes termed as the empire of opinion. Sedition made its presence in the statute books as early as 1870. And of course, its long and tragic impacts are still with us today. But of that later. Interestingly, more than the English language publications, many of which were set up by loyal subjects of the monarch, the British monarch, it was a circulation of news in the local languages that was viewed with the greatest suspicion as potential sources of disaffection against the Raj. Among the native population, it was important to have a law like the Vernacular Press Act of 1878, which allowed the colonial government to issue search warrants, raid premises, confiscate printing presses, all without judicial oversight. The overthrowing of the foreign yoke should have made a difference. But when freedom fighters turn rulers, things happen. The second and third sessions of the Constituent Assembly debates, held in April and July 1947, took place under the shadow of partition, which saw, as we know, at least 1 million perish. Paul Brass has observed that India's Republican Constitution was born more in fear and trepidation than in hope and inspiration. In the process, as Lawrence Liang has argued, Article 19(1)(a), which is from which we get our freedom of expression guarantee, Article 19(1)(a) and the restraints on it exemplified in Article 19(2) can be interpreted as an attempt to create a space for deliberative democracy, albeit a limited one, where the full citizen, and these are his words, and I like it, the full citizen and the infantilized citizen occupy the same sphere. The overweening impulse by various governments in post-independent India was to undermine the rights of the full citizen while persisting in infantilizing the infantilized citizen. What needs to be noted here that every party stands guilty on this count. Earlier this year, the Congress party in Karnataka came up with its misinformation and fake news prohibition bill. It has not yet become law, but it is quite an exceptionally bad law, if it does. It has such wide-ranging powers that all shades of dissent can be suppressed. But it is in the years of BJP rule that there have been exceptional twists to this story, partly because the drive to control information and dissent has been invested with an additional layer, the ideological dimension yoked to an authoritarian Hindutva project. So it's this that makes their controlling of the world of information so dangerous in a sense. It is precisely the broadness of this guarantee. The second aspect is how deeply this country, represented by the makers of our Constitution, have valued freedom of speech and expression, regarding as foundational to their idea of India. Despite the fact that the Constituent Assembly took place, as we saw, against a backdrop of great churn and unprecedented bloodshed, the members of the Assembly did not take their eyes off the ball. The fifth point in the resolution that brought about the Constituent Assembly, and we had Constitution Day just the other day being celebrated, the resolution that brought it about said, the fifth point in that resolution said that freedom of thought and expression, belief, faith, worship, vocation, association, and action, subject to law and public morality, are to be protected. It is important to recognize here the broad interlinkages made in this formulation. There can be no freedom of speech and expression without freedom of movement, freedom of assembly, freedom of occupation, freedom of belief. These are the things that animate freedom of expression and speech. These are freedoms that have buttressed and animated each other. So that the architecture is really, really based on all these freedoms acting together. It is precisely the broadness of this category, this guarantee, that potentially unfurls the full potential of the citizen as a thinking, acting being. And it is this that has filled the ruling classes over the years with the greatest dread. Therefore, it is also a guarantee that has been among the most contested. In fact, the blowback to it came in the Assembly itself, when Article 19.1a was qualified by Article 19.2, which Gautam Bhatia, the constitutional expert, observes as containing an eclectic mix of content-neutral and content-based restrictions, the precise nature of which depends heavily upon judicial interpretation. The word sedition was much decried during those debates. And if you go through the debates, you'll hear lots of people speaking out against sedition because the memory of how sedition was used against the national movement and people who participated in it was still very, very alive. And the way the British Raj had weaponized it against freedom fighters was also understood. In fact, there's a general consensus that the word sedition needed to be excised, and there was much applause when it was dropped from the draft constitution. It is another matter that it has remained in the Indian Penal Code, and over the years we saw how the political executive and its police were loath to see the end of it. In 2023, the Law Commission came up with a report recommending that it be retained. Today, it rests comfortably in a new lexical avatar in section 152 of the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita, which can penalize acts that the state considers as endangering the very words of sedition, the sovereignty, unity, and integrity of India, such as inciting secession or armed rebellion, and the punishments are pretty severe, including life imprisonment. But there have been, and friends, I think it is important to remember this, that there have been significant court rulings that made a difference. While the courts have all too often let us down through their rulings on freedom of speech over the years, I also believe that we have allowed ourselves to forget some extremely salient observations made by the courts. The book that I wrote plots the graph of state control. It also attempts to revisit judgments that have progressively interpreted and extended this guarantee, and about which many of us remain largely ignorant. Let me quickly touch upon some of these. Verdicts like Ramesh Thapar, which is Ramila's brother, he brought out a magazine called Crossroads and it was banned by the Madras government of the day. The verdict was delivered in 1950, shortly after this country got itself a constitution. It iterated the principle that freedom of speech and expression includes within its ambit the freedom to propagate ideas, i.e. that while the freedom of press is not explicitly underlined in the Constitution, and that's an interesting story, Ambedkar, when he was not in the Constituent Assembly, had given a resolution saying that the press must be seen as part of freedom of expression. But once he joined the assembly, he felt perhaps it's not necessary, and he had an argument for it. But there were many who felt offended by this and said, no, the press should be a part of this freedom. But in any case, the courts in independent India have interpreted the law in such a way that it includes freedom of the media. The Supreme Court was confronted with three important cases brought to it by big newspapers. Express newspapers versus the Union of India, 1959. Sakal papers versus the Union of India, 1961. Bennett Coleman versus Union of India, 1972. And remember, in those days, the newspapers were the media, and they had enormous clout. In fact, Mrs. Gandhi's emergency was actually targeting the newspapers of her day because they had huge influence over, although their readership will be much less than what it is today, it was still a very important institution. So when the courts were confronted with these three cases, almost a decade apart, they kind of quickly understood that it's best to defend freedom of expression in a very bland way. They recognize the right of the owners to have their freedom of expression. And in the process, of course, it's a very problematic, sort of concept that, freedom of press, okay, these big newspapers which control the market got this freedom so easily. And the courts actually, sort of defended that. Rightly so, maybe in some cases, but also it needs to be engaged with, because freedom of expression is something that can't be just taken for granted. There's so many layers in it. And in fact, one of the minority opinions in Bennett Coleman dissented with the main majority opinion, which sought to challenge, it was, the case involved the government's right to regulate newsprint on grounds of free speech. Remember, newsprint was the base on which newspapers existed, and therefore it was also a very regulated concept. There are times when, because we didn't have enough foreign exchange and so on, the quota of newsprint had to be sort of limited, and this gave rise. So the government was looking for ways to ensure that it was a level playing field, the government of that day. So they said that newspapers with pages less than 10 should have more newsprint quota. And Bennett Coleman was livid at that proposition. I'm going to quote on that. But there was that dissenting opinion which sought to challenge the government's right to regulate newsprint. The minority opinion recognized that freedom of expression is not only an individual good, but a social good. With the concentration of mass media in a few hands, the chance of an idea antagonistic to the idea of the proprietors of the big newspapers getting access to the market would become very remote. So the judge recognized that it can't be a simple assessment of access to newsprint. It went on to say that this affected the economic pattern of society. If newspaper proprietors have the right to freedom of expression, so too do readers to access multiple points of view. Another interesting judgment that can be flagged here was delivered 2 decades later. It was called the Cricket Association of Bengal and the Board for Cricket in India, BCCI, versus the Union of India, 1995. It grappled with the question of who exactly owned the airwaves. Now, the airwaves were seen by the state as its natural property. The radio and television in the early years were controlled completely by the government of the day, by the ministry of the day. And the point is, even to this day, news on radio is not allowed. So independent producers of news cannot use radio to put out their news. So that's the interesting thing, that, so the question of who owns the airwaves was posed. Was it the bureaucratic entities like Akashvani and Doordarshan, Prasar Bharati, which claim to represent the national interest? Was it the market and various commercial interests that owned private channels? Or was it the Indian public? That was the question the court raised. Interestingly, it avoided the familiar binary of government control versus commercial interests. It ruled that the airwaves, since they belong to all Indians, should be under the control of the public, as distinct from the government, which represents the views and interests of the ruling party and a few private individuals. I think that's a very wise thing, but of course, it was never, never translated into reality. It's another matter, of course, that the duopoly that this verdict hoped to bring to an end continues to this day. Control over broadcasting remains vested in the government through the agency of a Prasar Bharati, robbed of its autonomy, on the one hand, and on the other, powerful private channels, many of which control large cross-media empires. When you say cross-media, you're saying the same entity like Bennett Coleman has television, has FM radio, has newspaper, all under its belt. The digital era brought its own compulsions, which led to 3 significant judgments. The first was Shreya Singhal versus the Union of India, 2015. The second, delivered in 2018, was Justice K.S. Puttaswamy versus the Government of India. Finally, there was Anuradha Bhasin versus the Union of India 2020. In Shreya Singhal, the Supreme Court had to weigh in on a petition that challenged 66A of the IT Act 2000 and Section 69A, the first severely punished online posts that were deemed to be offensive. In fact, I don't know if you remember, but a couple of young women, one woman put out a post when Thackeray died and said that, you know, why should the city close down for him? You know? And that was enough for her to be jailed under 66A. And her friend who liked her post was also jailed. So, I mean, and there are many examples of this across the country. Mamta put through a cartoonist who did an ugly cartoon of her in jail. And he had to fight that case for, I think, almost a decade. So, I mean, these are major problems. And the court actually struck down 66A, which is we can say is a victory. The judgment recognized three principles which it saw as fundamental in understanding the right of freedom of speech and expression: discussion, advocacy, and incitement, and thirdly, incitement. He says the mere discussion or even advocacy of a certain cause, however unpopular, is at the heart of 19(1)A. It is also when such a discussion or advocacy reaches the level of incitement that Article 19(2) kicks in. In Puttaswamy, pronounced by a 9-judge constitution bench, the court unanimously ruled that informational privacy was an important aspect of the right to privacy. It also recommended that the government evolve a robust regime for data protection. Unfortunately, we have a Data Act that has come into play, but it is full of problems, of which I'll speak a little bit later. Anuradha Bhasin examined whether internet shutdowns, you remember after the abrogation of Article 370, there were, Kashmir was put under a deep freeze, and there was no internet for at least 3 months. The court here recognized that internet in this day and age is very much a part of our right to freedom of speech and expression. These are among the more progressive judgments on speech delivered by the highest court. But important verdicts by the High Court and the district courts have also emerged. There was a recent Delhi Sessions Court order that lifted an ex parte order banning journalists from publishing so-called defamatory reports against Adani. You can imagine how courageous that judge was. We need to remember these judgments because they have helped to deepen and broaden our understanding of the precious right of free speech, especially in times when constitutional rights can no longer be presumed to exist untrammeled. It is something that I think public bodies like this one should actually be invested in. And I'm glad that it is the subject of what, of this talk today. I just want to end with recalling a cartoon, a brilliant one, put out in the Times of India. It showed a policeman, a burly policeman, holding a hapless citizen by his lathi and standing in front of the judge and saying, "Your Honor, we caught this man red-handed. He was thinking." The next box, he didn't speak a word. And that says a lot about his intent. The next box, the tone of his unsaid words was inflammatory. And the last box, he even refused to deny what he never said. So we are in that quandary. We don't know, what we said and what we didn't say, and whether it fits the bill. But what's interesting about the quandary that we are facing is that, on the one hand, we have a government that's flooding the zone with information of its kind. Look at the ads put out before every election, fueled by money. Look at the ads on television. Adityanath is known to buy television support just through the strength of his advertising. They are flooding the zone with information. Look at the way the Prime Minister is there across countries, across cities, not across countries, but across cities, across the country, across cities. And let us not forget how Man Ki Baat has been allowed its, weekly run, a monthly run, for now well over, say, 7 or 8 years. So they're flooding the zone. But the point is, the pushback is that they want to ensure that we are not allowed to speak out. But speaking out, as I said, is of different kinds, and we need to be critically engaged with what is splitting. Nothing of what I said, really, nothing of what I said is against governments doing what they have to do in terms of steps to curb unlawful content or material that is likely to create violence. The state is justified in taking measures to stem the proliferation of falsehoods and content that perpetuates social harm. But what I want to say is that such measures should meet the standards of rationality, and regulatory bodies that are independent, the Law Commission, for instance, today is completely suborned to the government. So it's making all kinds. The Law Commission is the one who said that we need to have sedition back on the statute books. So when a so-called independent body like the Law Commission, is a body that one can no longer trust, if a body overseeing our elections is a body that turns into something we can no longer trust, how can we leave the regulation of our right to express ourselves in the hands of the government? That's the question facing us today. Nowhere in the Constitution is it set down that all Indians should speak patriotically. Yet, we had the case of Ali Khan Mahmoodabad being put in jail for a post that he placed in Facebook, saying that while he admired the Indian Army, he found the use of the spokesperson a bit discomforting. And that was enough to, throw him into jail, which was horrible. And the present Chief Justice ruled over that case. He was not Chief Justice then, he was just a Supreme Court judge. And he suggested that the professor was guilty of dog whistling and questioned the timing of the post. He not only ordered that the accused surrender his passport, but gagged him from commenting on something that he should as a foreign policy expert, Indo-Pak conflict. A SIT was ordered to inquire deeper into the supposed offensive post. So this man was really, seen as an enemy of the state. The verdict went against settled law that the judiciary does not have the power to silence anybody, only the power to decide on the constitutionality of the government's attempt to silence someone. So there is a difference. And that was the person who pronounced that verdict is now our Chief Justice today. So I would urge you to, follow his verdicts carefully. In fact, recently he came up with a suggestion, not suggestion. He asked the government to regulate user content to protect the rights of online abuse. This in itself is unobjectionable. But what is objectionable are regulatory bodies that use this to strengthen the government's control over citizens' rights. And I'm sure the government will be only too happy to follow what Surya Kant has told them, Justice Surya Kant has told them to do. And I'm also sure that the regulatory bodies will also follow the government's lead on this matter. So where do we start? Perhaps by making governments understand that an edifice built on silencing speech will collapse one day and take their leaders with them. Perhaps by educating our young people, and I should say this in a school, young people to understand the importance of critically engaging with what they read, view, and post. Perhaps by making the mainstream media realize that the charade they enact every day and every night can only take them so far. And soon the viewers, readers, and the likes they depend on for their advertising pipeline may seriously decline. Also, perhaps by supporting small independent news portals like The Wire, which I am from, or The Scroll, or so many others, which are really struggling to survive, which are perpetually strapped for cash. So it's something that exists, and institutions that exist that are working in some way to help our guarantees succeed need support. And also perhaps through conversations like this. I'm so glad that Manthan has carried on for 20 years against many odds. I know it's tough for people to come from long distances, given the state of traffic, given the state of distances in cities. But you have kept it going for so many years, and for that, a special salam.
Giving us this very interesting talk, laying out the issues, as it were, on first the history of freedom of speech as it has evolved in India, from the colonial restrictions to the constitutional debates, and now where we are today. And yes, I think it is very important to mention what was said by the Chief Justice yesterday, and what we may be up against. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions.
Pamela, that was wonderful.
Thank you.
I actually don't have a question except for a rhetorical one, which I'm sure everyone has, for which there is no answer, I'm sure. Yeah. So I just want to thank you and tell you how much we admire you and the people that you work for, the people that you represent. We admire your courage, and I really think, like you said, we ought to do a lot more. On my behalf, now and then I keep, donating whatever, but I understood that it's not enough. We should do it on a more regular basis. This morning I got an alert from Netflix, an auto-pay alert. And it got me thinking, I'm paying 650 rupees. And I thought back, how much did I use of Netflix? I hadn't even watched a single film for a month. And I was thinking, every day I listen to some interview or the other on my walk from The Wire. Every day I at least read one article. So I thought, I'm going to subscribe to this on a monthly basis, not just an erratic. So that is something that I wanted.
My question to you is how much of the economics of media affect the freedom of speech. For example, many newspapers depend on government advertising as their single largest advertiser. You have hinted about Yogi Adityanath and Also, you mentioned about how much they take the media space. You also mentioned about newsprint subsidies that come from the government. But I just want to know how much government controls the media through the advertising that they give, and are they partial to some people and not partial to others?
Digital media has done, to some extent, what the internet has enabled is, organizations that can actually function without huge infrastructures. For instance, to set up a television channel today would be prohibitive for anyone who has no other agenda. So what you see on television news channels are proliferating, but they're all there for their own purposes. So have a look at all the TV news that you see on, just scroll down and you'll see all kinds of strange, entities, owning these kind of channels. And that is because it's very expensive. Television means that you need support of various kinds to keep running on a day-to-day process. Digital, on the other hand, does not have too many, infrastructures of the kind that television requires. And therefore, much of the independent journalism that is happening today has actually shifted to digital news. When you say that Scroll, for instance, is doing independent news, it's because they have relatively less investments in the project. The business model of newspapers and television sometimes makes it impossible to sustain itself. And that's where the government actually can get its foot in the door. It has always done so in all governments from the days of post-independence onwards. But today it is even more aggressive in the way it is using its advertising. Earlier, there would be a sense of fair play that you may have your favorites, but everyone is entitled to a little bit of government money to keep going. Here, it is not the case. Now, it's targeted patronage that we are seeing in some of the bigger organizations and entities.
On a more fundamental freedom of speech as a concept, and if one looks at the United States and India, the First Amendment in the US, and even today under President Trump, the type of parody which late night shows, etc., they go after the leading political figures. And of course, they are being bullied, etc., but they are still able to come back. So at what point did India as a democracy with such a fine constitution, its sort of fine leadership, political and bureaucratic, which was there, at what point did we not manage to make it very clear that something like a First Amendment is an inviolate right and it should remain? Why is it still open to so much of interpretations, and why are courts so pussyfooting this very fundamental right, ma'am? Any thoughts on that? Thank you.
Yes, I think that was the first instance where, control of the press. Those days it was only the press, because already television and radio was in the kitty of Mrs. Gandhi. The point is that she actually ensured that she could silence the media in many ways. And what is interesting, if you compare the journalists of that day with the journalists today, you will find that people in those days tried to fight back. And at the very least, they did not keel over like what is happening today. They did not invest themselves in the media of today, in the Modi project or whatever, So there was a little bit of independence in spite of so much repression. Because there too, jail terms, we've heard of Kuldeep Nair and others. The midnight knock became famous in that period. So, but journalists of the day were a little better. I was a young, when I joined the Times of India, it was my first experience. I entered the newsroom and one June day, I entered the newsroom and I noticed that everyone in the busy newsroom, which is normally full of, argumentation and noise and, and the teleprinter going clack, clack, clack at the back, all that, there was silence. The teleprinter was there, but it was spewing out news of how Mrs. Gandhi has imposed an emergency. And none of us even knew what an emergency was at that point. And I remember Kushwant Singh, the Times of India had the Illustrated Weekly on the 3rd floor, and we were on the 2nd floor with the Times of India newsroom and Navbharat Times and others. And Kushwant Singh came down and addressed us. And we all gathered around and looked at him. And he said, I have decided that I will not bring out the magazine for 2 issues at least. This is awful what has happened. I mean, he went on in his fine baritone. He attacked the emergency and all the rest of it. Within a fortnight, he had keeled over. The magazine came out, and one of his cover stories, sooner or later, was on Sanjay Gandhi and his Maruti. And also he did an interview with Sanjay Gandhi, which he put on the cover. So you could see that, let's say the benefits of keeling over was definitely there. And even people who felt that they had a strong backbone and a mind to go with it, succumbed a lot. There were some others who tried to fight back more. B.G. Varghese was one person. But Arun Shourie came a little later. Arun Shourie came, he was not there, quite there at that point. But yeah, Arun Shourie later did some good reporting. That's because he also got a lot of support from various entities. And Goenka is a very interesting person because he had his politics and he was definitely Goenka is a steady figure right from independence onwards, And the National Media Commission that was set up in the 50s, he actually fought against it because he felt that they were trying to control the press. And he had a lot of skin in the game, the sense that he was the biggest publisher at that time. And he fought back quite hard and faced a little bit of repression during the emergency, in fact, quite a bit. So, but he actually, so he allowed Arun Shourie to, come in and take on the Congress governments in various places. And Antule and that whole investigation was part of that. It was under a time when, there was a fight back against the emergency. But again, driven by politics of some kind or the other. But again, that's par for the course. Yeah.
A question, I'm going from the general down to your specific situation, if you don't mind, a little personal. So I saw on your profile that you were the current ombudsman at The Wire. So from that experience, could you give one example of something good that you experienced as in your role, and something on the other side, something that you'd wish not to see happen, without getting specific, if necessary?
You know that Meta, for putting out a story that was later seen as false, and it was true that it didn't stand up to the standards of probity. So not because it was intentionally done, it was because the editors did not understand the nature of digital media, digital advertising. So that was a tough time because, you had big entities like Meta is owned by Facebook and so it seemed as if the Wire project could be blown away because the projects of this kind really depend on the credibility of what you put out. So if what you put out is seen to have failed that test, then it is difficult. And I had to speak out, and sometimes there have been instances of certain individuals in the organization being accused of sexual harassment. So those were also very difficult things to handle, because they're colleagues and so on. And so, I mean, basically it's tough to be in that kind of a position of having to judge and so on. And not that I claim to have done the job well, but whatever it is, one tries, So having said that, in terms of the good part of it, I think there are moments. I think the Pegasus story was very important because it showed you the extent of surveillance. All the people, many of the people in the government's list, Pegasus list, were journalists. So there was a interest in controlling what their sources. You see, for the journalist, if you get to their sources, you finish off journalism. Because if sources dry out of fear or whatever, it means that journalism is dead in the water. So that was the worry that happened at that point. But I think the stories that you put out became international. It had an international dimension because the nexus between the Israeli state and its sophisticated surveillance machinery and its links with governments across the world was exposed through that story.
Sort of this creep of control of the media or expression through the media now you find is extending itself to other spaces as well, right? So at conferences, particularly social sciences and humanities conferences,
Absolutely.
you find that people are being told they cannot invite certain people who have contrary views or sensitive views. So I'm wondering, and that is a space, a university space or a space of, that kind of critical thinking, if that is what actually feeds young journalists and that is being controlled, I think there's, a much more insidious sort of spread of this. So I'm just wondering how you think of that as a journalist.
No, I agree with you completely. I think the lecturer, the professor, the teacher, and the journalist, they're all comrades at some level. And unless that bond, because that is your information, that is your font of information and knowledge and research. And if you muddy that font, then you have muddied the sources of information. And the point is that the government has also realized that, and the onslaught on universities are very much a part of that. That work, that brilliant piece of work done by Sabyasachi Das for the Ashoka University, for which he was awarded, he was thrown out. I don't know if he was thrown out, in a formal way, but he felt he had to leave. So that tells you, because he had something very important to say, that he says that governments, especially governments created by the BJP, are dependent on those areas where the margin of victory between, the winner and the loser are narrow. And so there's a way of using information and data to actually prime the electoral thing. Now, it's got more sophisticated since then, because now you're having the election commission doing, being the party that is part of this entire structure. So it's worrying. But come back to your question, it's so important that that the university space and the educational space, because here I think even school children and schooling, which is again being taken over by your various, textbook changes and your policy changes and so on being made. So what you're seeing is that right from the beginning, kids are being, you talk to professors in universities today, and they say that now we are having students who have learned under this new system, and they come completely brainwashed, in the sense that they're more than willing to accept the information that the government puts out. So then the task of the journalist to write against this becomes that much more difficult. And therefore, I think we are going to see tough times in the days ahead. Because I think, like they say, flooding the zone, they have done that in terms of information collapse.
Very interesting and insightful conversation that I've had up till now. So I'm extremely new to just understanding the politics of things and free speech, free media, right? And if I talk about my generation, right, we are supremely overwhelmed with the digital media aspect of it, right? And as you mentioned earlier as well, there is such a lack of credibility and lack of trust that comes in, that even for The Wire, for example, and this fiasco that had happened, right? I used to follow it for a while and this happened. And the aftermath of it made me distrust Wire again, right? And I don't know personally anybody there, so there's no reason to really follow it anymore. Similarly, that goes for independent journalists and just media in general, right? And in terms of misinformation as well, there's a lot of lie there, but there's also a lot of omission of truth.
Yes.
So when I have conversations, and they're very minimal, honestly, with my peers, it's just we don't really know what is true, what is untrue, and what is the right way right way forward in terms of finding out the full truth, and I'm talking about here, right? So maybe something that you would suggest and advise me, and that I can tell my peers as to, this is a way where we can genuinely believe and sort of, just trust the source of the piece of information, because we want to be woke, we want to know the piece of news, we just aren't able to bring ourselves to really trust it, the source, the credibility, whatever is behind it, right? Maybe one that these days I don't even know if that's fully, but like Fair D'Souza is one, right? We know of this one name. So maybe more such journalists or news houses that you can tell us that are genuinely something that we can follow, basically. And also that, how can I increase these conversations with my peers? Because we are so detached from this at this point that we want to get in, but we just also, it's so overwhelming and it feels like such a lie most of the days.
Thank you for your question, because it shows the point that part of this entire, this speech is also the silence. Silences are very much a part of this process. And once, and silences can be for various reasons. It can be driven by, pragmatic reasons. It can be driven by fear. And what we are seeing is a combination of speech and silence, which creates a sort of an area of darkness created by disinformation, misinformation. Now, the difference between the two, of course, is important to know. Disinformation is actually prejudged and predetermined information. It's weaponized information. Misinformation, you can say, can also arise out of ignorance and so on. But the use of these tactics is now very much a part of media. So I think the only way, I try to hint that it should start very young. People should actually question what they're reading, ask questions, And silencing that question, I think, is a very dangerous thing we're doing to the younger group that is growing up, Because questions are what really drives knowledge.
From what she says as well, less and less people watch television or even read newspapers now. Even the legacy news websites, nobody's following. Everyone gets their news out of YouTube. So in this scenario, you start thinking whether, like she said, very few conversations. She's one of the few who even is asking that question about what is true and what is not, etc. But I get very confused, because whether journalism in the form that we think should exist does not exist, do you see any hope at all that it can come back? Because considering all the institutions taken over, wherever the voices, the knowledge, the thought is supposed to come, universities, or whether it is seminars, or it is the pages of newspapers or magazines. Is there any hope? Even digital space, very difficult for a wire or a scroll to survive, and all of us know that. And those spaces are also getting taken over. We hope that technology would be an answer in terms of bringing down costs, but those are also being taken over.
To be as credible as possible. I know the efforts you have, and you bring perspective very often that is lacking in that of your peers and juniors. But the thing is, television is really a study of what should not happen, because NDTV, for instance, was a credible. It had credibility. Despite everything, people did go to it for relatively more balanced news. But then, of course, that got finished off. The trouble is, how do we protect the spaces that exist? That is one question. The other is through conversations. I think it is only by raising these issues as, I feel so bad that freedom of speech or the independence of the media has never been a burning election issue. Never. No one has come out on the streets. Actually, in Hungary, people have come out on the streets for their television, But here, we have not had that kind of popular movement. To some extent, during the hijab controversy, we had groups like Hate Speech Beda that came out, which is a very good initiative. There were people who wanted to push back against the flood of communal reporting. And so they went to TV stations and said, listen, don't do this because we see you for what you are doing, And that kind of personal engagement, I understand completely that these are structures that ordinary people can't really reach. But the point is, even lateral entries are very important. The ordinary person on the street has a power, which we see that, the present government has been able to weaponize. The third person, the intermediary who objects to love jihad, where does he come from? He or she come from? Comes from ordinary people. But that is the lateral entry. And what we should have is a lateral entry of sense, rationality, of the demand for a more equal kind of journalism, and that is not there. And that is what we need. We need people on the streets to say we find this very important. It is important. It doesn't seem important, but it is crucial, And like Usha and others said, the shades are so graded. It touches entire populations from the level of a school to, geriatric clubs. It's all there. People are there. The public sphere that Habermas spoke about is there for us to try and make sense of and contribute and get involved.
This is the first time I came here, and I come across Manthan yesterday itself. So, and my question is like, so I'm not fluent in English, but I will try to explain.
Good. I like young voices. Speak up.
Okay. We see like suppressing free speech and in India, and especially we see today, like in the world level also, in the many countries, like the rise of authoritarian governments, regimes, we can say right wing especially. So and they are like suppressing free speech everywhere, like when it is Palestinian issue, when it is more. So what? How do we see? Like, is there any common ground in the world level? Like in many countries, it is happening. And do we trace any parallels to the history? For suppose in the late 1920s, during Great Depression, we saw after that the rise of Hitler.
The Weimar Republic.
Yeah. So do we see like any commonalities, like why it happened, like suppressing the free speech even more? Like it was relatively better when the authoritarian, when the right-wing regimes are not there in place. But is there any common ground in the history and now in this? And next question is that, like, yes, that you, madam, you are talking, like, how do we, like, now common people, like, if I go to a common area, a bus stand, like, when I speak about, like, this political rights, like free speech, and nowadays, like, it's the vote chori also, like, these are, like, for common people, how do we tell them, like, why is it needed, like, how do we convey that, how is it related to their day-to-day regular life?
Very difficult, you know. But coming to your first question, you know, I'm glad you raised that Weimar thing, because you know what the brown shirts, the black shirts, sorry. Was it black shirts or brown shirts? Anyway, what the Nazis did was burning books. That burning books was very important. There was a huge movement to burn all the literature that went against the notion of a Nazi world. And that's the thing, destroying knowledge of various kinds was actually the basis on which the Adolf Hitler could really, you know, culturally build himself. So that's happening, and you see that in the MAGA movement in the US today. You know, they are fueled by Christian fundamentalists who believe in creation theory, and so, I mean, who don't believe in, they believe that God created the world according to intelligent design. These are the kind of concepts that are put out, and therefore it is very difficult. I think it is very important. I mean, I'm thinking as I'm speaking, I think it's important to understand the concepts being put out by people who are trying to suppress you know, citizens' rights. They put out certain concepts, and it's important to actually dismantle those concepts. You know, and so vote chori is interesting. Vote chori is very important. But the people of Bihar didn't think so, it seems. And why? We don't know whether results in Bihar went according to the book. But it seems that the vote chori as a concept did not, you know, capture the imagination of the people. Perhaps because people in Bihar understood that vote chori was there in all systems. You know, everyone remembered how vote chori happened in the pre-digital era also, pre-EVM era. So perhaps it didn't. But I think it is important to engage with people on that. And sometimes elections are not the right place to engage with people, because elections need, you know, formulaic kind of response, you know, slogans and so on that will capture this thing. Here you needed to explain how your vote is so important and how it can determine whether you and your future family can exist in this country as Indian citizens. We know that citizenship and voting are interlinked, and what you see in Assam is the, you know, separation of the two. And that, so this is a very dangerous thing that is happening, but people don't understand. And then they will see that they can't vote, and then they'll see that they are no longer citizens. So it's a very dangerous thing, and it's a very important issue, but unfortunately it didn't capture the imagination sufficiently.
Every bit of it. But I also have certain doubts. You didn't talk about WhatsApp and Facebook. You know, the sort of arguments that are put forward in WhatsApp and Facebook are very important. Some the government tries to control, some don't. You might get one kind of information and you don't get another kind of information. But it's still very important because you can't touch it. It comes in and goes off. The other thing in this information bias that is taking place, what is equally important, you touched upon it, but you didn't build it further. We're an extremely diversified country. You know, this vote chori, and that it didn't get explained there and is now getting explained, is part of this diversity. And while your lecture is brilliant and makes us think further, I just thought I'd bring up these two issues also and sometime you can.
Yeah, so Facebook and WhatsApp are creatures of digital media. Now, what happened during digital media was that people had the unique ability to self-communicate. And people have theorized on self-communication. Earlier, it was messages came to you. Now you could put your messages out in the world. And that was a transformative moment. But it was also a fraught moment because it allowed information to flood the place without sufficient checks and balances that the legacy media brought through their investment in things like the sub-editor's desk and so on. There was this attempt to at least fact check and put information through the filter of, rationality and so on. There's radio waves being put out to the market was done in radio with FM radio. But FM radio, it was first put out. And it was very localized, of course, FM radio. And therefore, they controlled also what could be put out. So entertainment was fine. You can have your jokes. You can have your songs. You can have everything. But you can't have news. You can't do stuff that could, upset the balance of the control of information. Because we became, internet users in India has overtaken the rest of the world. And precisely because data was cheaper than anywhere else in the world, and policies allowed this data to be permeating. And it also built empires. So Jio has helped build the Ambani empire in ways that we wouldn't have imagined. And that is why Adani, with all his wealth, needed media support. So that's how it will go. That's why it's important to have counters. But again, it's the David and Goliath situation.
Well, my doubt is about what are the boundaries of freedom of speech as we tell about it. Freedom of speech, essentially, when you talk about it, what's the extent of it and how far can it go? Because I believe that when you have freedom of speech in a society or in a state itself, the ultimate which it would lead to is anarchy. And when we speak about information and truth, I believe that truth is wealth, as information itself is called wealth. So anyone who has control over information or has the first-hand information is essentially wealthy and will know what happened in the future itself. So essentially, should our goal be knowing the truth, or is it about combating the false information which spreads in society to control the chaos? Because freedom of speech, truth, at its ultimate goal, will lead to anarchy, the fall of state itself. Because multiple intellectuals, because I believe society, when it's formed, it is basically formed on cooperation, and cooperation stems from fear. It's a primal instinct because of which our forefathers are the primal humans and all, formed a group or a collective society which eventually evolved into societies. So when we encompass this, what do we call, intellectualism and truth and information, so will it lead to cooperation?
Question.
So this is why. The question is whether, is it about the truth or information, or whether it's about combating the false narrative?
Sufficiently, which is the limits of free speech. And of course, we've seen the proliferation of hate speech. So how do we understand hate speech and its impacts on people? It is a proliferation of a certain kind of speech. So there are norms that guide speech that need to be understood. And you have talked about cooperation in society, consensus in society. These are important ideas that we need to keep in mind. And freedom of speech always has its boundaries. It cannot be without boundaries for the very reason that it is a very potent source of conflict, as you have rightly pointed out. So how do we understand this? I think this is understanding the balance, and that is where your credibility of information is very important. And also, who is speaking? Whose speech? Why are they speaking? What are they speaking? When are they speaking? These are questions that should strike the person who is watching someone speak. So as you watched me and rightly critiqued me on not setting boundaries, you have already done half the job for me. You have already questioned the premise or the seeming premise. I agree with you there that free speech cannot be unbound.
Small part of my life. I struggled for 5 years, then I came out with a solution. When I'm giving financial planning to people, now I made it a 20-year plan, earlier it used to be 40 years. The reason is, the risk is increasing for the common man, for the living. So I am trying to protect myself from section 66A. So I've come out with an idea. I will quote from the Rig Veda. In the Rig Veda, everything was foretold that if you play this dirty game, you will lose your kingdom, your wife will hate you, your mother-in-law will hate you, nobody will have pity. But it is also given, if the king is talking more about himself, in Atharvaveda it is given. People should understand it's a sign of a danger to the economy.
And insecurity.
Yeah. So why can't people like Manthanites engage with one-to-one person with the use of gamification?
What you say is completely true. And I don't know how to answer your question, actually, because these are questions that actually the future is full of insecurity and probabilities, improbabilities. We know that technology is fast, changing, and its impacts are being felt, and we don't even understand how it's impacting us and our ideas. What is AI doing to us as a human society?
It is replacing common sense.
It is, in many ways, unless, of course, we can control this technology because it has its uses. So it's that as well.